4 years of fluorescent lights, 4 years of polite nods from people who couldn't remember my name unless they needed a filing number, 4 years of swallowing the quiet humiliation of being treated like furniture in a room that belonged to someone else. And all it took to end it was one slide on a projector screen at a black tie gala where the champagne cost more than most of the grants we'd actually approved that year. I'd like to say I was surprised by the look on Arthur Vance's face when the numbers finally caught up to him. I wasn't. What I was ready. Welcome back to the kind of stories where patience does the heavy lifting and paperwork pulls the trigger. Grab whatever you're drinking, settle in, and remember, the people in these rooms always believe the rules don't apply to them. They just forget that rules have a way of waiting. Let me back you up a little because this story doesn't start in a ballroom. It doesn't start with a projector screen or a microphone or the sudden, sharp silence of a man who just realized his kingdom is built on sand. It starts in a basement archive on a Tuesday in October, 4 years before any of this, when I was elbow deep in a banker's box that smelled like old paper and forgotten promises, looking for a misplaced 1998 donor acknowledgement letter that Arthur swore he'd filed under V for Vanguard Foundation. I knew he hadn't. Arthur Vance didn't file things. He commissioned them to exist somewhere between his assistant's inbox and the recycling bin. I never found the Vanguard letter. What I found instead was a brittle manila folder wedged behind a stack of water-damaged board minutes from the late 80s, its edges curled like dried leaves, its tab handwritten in faded blue ballpoint. Whitmore Family Trust, Addendum C, 1991. I almost put it back, I really did. I had 3 more boxes to sort, a quarterly report due by Friday, and a boss who measured productivity by how quickly you disappeared when he needed something else done. But I sat down on a folding chair that groaned under my weight, wiped the dust off the cover with my sleeve, and opened it. Maybe it was boredom. Maybe it was the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from spending 3 years being called the archivist by a man who treats your title like a consolation prize. Or maybe it was something older and quieter than either of those, the kind of instinct that wakes up when you're standing in a room full of other people's legacy and you finally notice the cracks in the foundation. I read it slowly. The way you read something when you don't yet know what it is but your pulse has already decided it matters. It was a trust addendum, drafted in the stiff, unadorned prose of lawyers who assumed no one would ever actually look at it. Page after page of asset allocation clauses, succession protocols, community distribution mandates, and fiduciary guardrails dressed in language so dry it practically crackled when you turned the page. I was halfway through section 7 when my eyes caught it. Not a shout, not a warning, just a sentence buried in paragraph 4, subsection D, wearing the kind of bureaucratic camouflage designed to make your brain skip over it like a speed bump you've driven past 1,000 times. Should the executive director fail to disperse a minimum of 35% of the foundation's total annual asset valuation to vetted, externally audited community programs for 3 consecutive fiscal years, operational control, voting authority, and stewardship of the endowment shall automatically revert to the designated legacy steward, as named in the original 1986 charter, pending board acknowledgement and compliance verification. I read it once, then again, then a third time, tracing the words with my index finger like I was trying to feel the weight of them. I didn't breathe for a moment. I just sat there in the humming quiet of the archive, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead, the smell of dust and old glue settling around me, and I did the math. 35%, 3 consecutive years, externally audited, vetted community programs, not administrative overhead, not gala sponsorships, not executive retreats disguised as strategic planning sessions. Real money. Real programs, real impact, and if it didn't happen, control reverted, not to the board, not to Arthur, to the designated legacy steward. I flipped back to the 1986 charter reference, cross-referencing the naming convention, and found it 2 pages earlier in the same folder. Elias Thorne, appointed by the founding family as permanent steward in perpetuity, successor line to be maintained through archival designation. Elias Thorne, my grandfather. A man I'd met exactly twice before he died, a quiet farmer who signed the original charter in a bank lobby in 1986 because he believed in what the trust was supposed to be, not what it had become. I sat very still for a long time, then I closed the folder, stood up, brushed the dust off my trousers, and walked back upstairs to my desk. I didn't tell anyone, not that day, not that week. I went home, poured a glass of water I didn't really want, and sat at the kitchen table until the streetlights came on. Then I called my wife. Alina answered on the 3rd ring, her voice already carrying the particular cadence she used when she'd just finished reviewing a nonprofit's tax filings for the evening. "Tell me you're not eating takeout over the sink again," she said. "I'm not," I said. "I'm at the table." "Good. What's wrong?" I told her. I read it to her slowly, word for word, the way you read a prescription when you're not sure you want to take the medicine, but you know you probably should. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. I could hear the soft tap of her pen against the counter, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the quiet rhythm of a woman who had spent 12 years auditing charitable organizations and had learned exactly how money moves when no one is watching. Read the threshold again, she said, 35%, consecutive fiscal years. Externally audited community programs. She exhaled, slow and measured. Craig, do you have access to the last 3 years of distribution reports? Not yet, I said, but I can pull them. I'm the archivist. I can pull anything. Don't pull them yet, she said, not officially, not through the system. If you request them through the foundation portal, it logs. If it logs, Arthur sees it. If Arthur sees it, he starts moving numbers. I know, I said, so we wait, she said, but you start tracking, you track everything. Every grant proposal, every board vote, every memo that reclassifies operational costs as outreach. You document it offline, you timestamp it, you cross-reference it with public filings, you build a parallel ledger and you don't tell anyone, not a soul, even Randy, especially not Randy. He nodded before I said it. I'm already building it, she said. I've got a template. I'll walk you through it tomorrow. You bring me the raw files. I'll run the verification. We don't move until we hit year 3. And we don't strike until he's standing in front of a room full of donors claiming he's exceeded the threshold. I closed my eyes. That's a long time, I said. 4 years is a long time, she said, but you're not waiting for 4 years. You're waiting for 3 fiscal cycles, and you're not waiting passively. You're keeping score. I looked at the ceiling fan turning slowly above us, the way it always did when the summer heat finally broke and the house settled into that quiet, heavy stillness that only comes in October. I've been keeping score since I started working here, I said. I just didn't know what the scoreboard was for. Now you do, she said. Sleep. Tomorrow we start. I slept, but not well, not because I was afraid. Because for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't just surviving the room. I was mapping it. And mapping a room is a very different thing than living in it. Here's what you need to understand about Arthur Vance before I go any further, because this story belongs to him just as much as it belongs to me, even if he'll never admit it. Arthur is 61 years old. He has the kind of face that photographs well in low light and the kind of posture that suggests he was born standing at a podium. He wears tailored suits that never quite fit the foundation's actual mission, but always fit the donor galas perfectly. He speaks in measured cadences, uses words like synergize and align and stewardship like their currency, and has spent the better part of a decade convincing a board of retired executives and civic leaders that a foundation's primary job is to look successful rather than actually do the work. He didn't build the Whitmore Foundation. He inherited the directorship when the previous director retired early for health reasons, and he treated the appointment like a promotion he'd earned through sheer force of personality. He had a way of making people feel important while quietly ensuring they never actually held power. He called me the archivist the way you call a waiter your server, not with malice, with assumption. It was load-bearing behavior for him. He needed someone to manage the past so he could curate the present. He gave me a desk in the archive wing because Alina had mentioned to a board member at a holiday reception that I had a background in institutional record-keeping, and he couldn't say no in front of someone who wrote 6-figure checks. He called me a meticulous young man at a staff lunch in front of 40 people and thought he was being encouraging. The man had no idea what was living inside his own filing system. The plan required 2 things, patience and precision. I needed to complete 3 full fiscal cycles with a spotless, unimpeachable employment record while making myself just visible enough that Arthur's frustration stayed contained. Not enough to justify performance issues, just enough to keep him simmering. Alina called it strategic documentation. I called it the most exhausting performance of my life. For 4 full years, I did everything right on paper and everything quietly wrong in Arthur's gut. I requested audit trails politely, with proper forms and CC'd board liaisons, which is somehow worse than rudeness to a man who prefers his numbers flexible. I copied the compliance officer on distribution memos Arthur would have preferred stayed informal. I took my full lunch hour every single day. I stopped laughing at his golf anecdotes. I started arriving at exactly 8:30 and leaving at exactly 5, which in Arthur Vance's world was basically a resignation letter he couldn't technically accept. You've been very consistent lately, Arthur told me one morning, stirring his coffee like a man who'd seen too many TED Talks about organizational discipline. Something on your mind, kid, just focused on the archives, I said. They're looking clean. He didn't like that answer. He wanted me eager. I gave him competent, and competent made him angrier than anything else I could have offered. I didn't know it yet, but Marcus Lynn, Arthur's deputy director and personal shadow, had already started whispering in Arthur's ear, telling him I'd gotten too comfortable, that I was building something. I found this out from Clara later, the receptionist who heard everything and said nothing, which made her the most powerful person on the second floor. Then came the reclassification memo. It was Arthur who drafted it, which was the only way it would work. He circulated it quietly through internal channels, the kind of document that never sees the light of day unless someone is actively looking for it. It redefined community outreach to include executive travel, donor appreciation events, and administrative training. Alina found it within 48 hours. She didn't react. She just highlighted it, time-stamped it, and added it to the parallel ledger. He's trying to blur the line, she said over dinner, her voice calm, her eyes sharp. He thinks if he expands the definition, he can claim the threshold without actually moving the money. Let him, I said, it just makes the gap wider. She smiled, the real one. The one that 4 years of foundation galas with Arthur had made rare enough that I kept count. We landed on the gala date, November 12th, year 3. I stood in the back of the ballroom, watching Arthur adjust his cufflinks in the reflection of a crystal chandelier, and I knew exactly how this would play out. You ready? Alina asked, her hand resting lightly against my arm. I've been ready for 4 years, I said. That's not what I asked. I looked at her. Yeah, I said, I'm ready. She nodded and said nothing else, but her grip loosened just slightly, and I noticed, and I didn't say anything about it either. That's 12 years of marriage working the way it's supposed to. We didn't go to the office that night. Tuesday was for the gala, the applause, the careful choreography of people pretending to care about things they never actually funded. I'd learned over 4 years that the most powerful thing you can do to a man who needs control is give him silence. No challenges, no public corrections, no graveling, just nothing. And nothing to a man like Arthur is absolutely deafening. Randy came by that evening, which was unusual, but he'd been invited as a donor liaison and had stopped by afterward with the energy of a man who had been waiting 3 years to hear a full debrief. Walk me through the ledger, he said, settling into my armchair like he owned it, which he basically did given how many hours he'd logged in it helping us cross-reference state filings. Start from the first reclassification. So I did. And when I got to the part where we documented every diverted grant, every inflated administrative cost, every memo that quietly moved money from communities to conference hotels, Randy covered his face with both hands and made a sound that was somewhere between a groan and a prayer. You've been tracking this for 44 months, he said. I have, and you didn't say anything to anyone, not a word. He looked at Alina. Is he always like this? 12 years, she said, pouring herself a glass of water. You get used to it. Randy raised his glass to Addendum C, 1991. We drank to that, all three of us. And for about an hour sitting in our living room with the ceiling fan turning slow overhead and the city doing its quiet November thing outside the windows, everything felt almost too easy. I didn't know it yet, but Easy was about to take an extended leave of absence. Wednesday, November 13th, day one of the rest of Arthur Vance's life, though he didn't know it yet. I put on my best suit, the charcoal one Alina picked out 3 winters ago that Arthur once called a little much for the archives, and I drove downtown. I parked in my usual spot in the foundation garage, took the elevator to the second floor, and walked through the glass doors of the Whitmore Family Trust Administrative Wing. At exactly 8:59 in the morning, the reception area went quiet the way a restaurant goes quiet when someone walks in and everyone recognizes them, but nobody wants to be the first to say so. Clara was at her desk. She looked up and her eyes did 3 things in rapid succession: relief, panic, and then the professional mask that she'd spent 10 years perfecting. She was good, but I was better. Morning, Clara, I said. Mr. Thorne, she said carefully. I wasn't sure we'd be seeing you today. Why wouldn't you? She opened her mouth, closed it, glanced down the hall toward Arthur's corner office. Mr. Vance called a department head meeting for 9. Perfect, I said. I love department head meetings. I went anyway. The conference room on the second floor has floor-to-ceiling windows that look out over the river, which is a beautiful view that nobody ever actually looks at because Arthur Vance fills every room he enters the way weather fills a forecast. He was standing at the head of the table when I walked in, reading glasses on, a stack of papers in front of him, looking every one of his 61 years and refusing to acknowledge a single one of them. Marcus was to his left. Always Marcus, always positioned exactly 1 seat closer to Arthur than everyone else, was to his right. Eleanor Shaw, the board's swing vote, and the only person in that room whose opinion actually mattered in the long run, was at the far end, reviewing a tablet with the focused disinterest of a woman who had seen everything. The room had 6 people in it. It had 7 when I walked in. Arthur looked up, and here is what I want you to understand about that moment. The man did not flinch. 61 years of curated authority had given him a face that simply did not register surprise in any visible way. What crossed his expression instead was something slower and more deliberate: recalibration. like a chess player who just watched the opponent make a move he hadn't expected and was now deciding whether to be impressed or annoyed. He chose annoyed. He always chose annoyed. Craig, he said, the way you say the name of a clerk who has just handed you a form you didn't ask for. Arthur, I said, the way you say the name of a man who doesn't know he's already lost. I sat down, helped myself to the water pitcher in the center of the table, poured slowly. Nobody said a word. Marcus was looking at his notepad with the intensity of a man trying to telepathically communicate that he wanted no part of whatever was about to happen. The board meeting packet has been distributed, Arthur said quietly, which was somehow worse than loud. I received mine, I said, over email. Yes, I took a sip of water. This is good. Did we get a new pitcher? This is not the time, Marcus started. Marcus, Arthur said, and Marcus stopped immediately, which was the most exercise Marcus's spine had gotten in years. Arthur kept his eyes on me. You're here for archival compliance verification. That means you take notes. That means you don't speak unless asked, and that is not your water. I'd like to speak with the compliance officer, I said. Silence, I clarified. The one who handles external distribution audits. I have some questions about my filing protocols. Routine stuff. I said the word routine the way you'd say it about something that was absolutely not routine. Arthur stared at me for a long moment. His jaw was doing that thing it does. That slow tightening thing that Alina once told me he'd done since he took the directorship, usually right before something in the office got very quiet or very cold. Get out of my sightline, he said. Sure, I said, standing, buttoning my jacket. Tell compliance I'll be at the diner on 4th. She knows where it is. I looked around the table. Good seeing everybody. Alina loved that scarf. Alina Shaw pressed her lips together very firmly to conceal something that might have been a smile. I walked out. Behind me, I heard Arthur say something to Marcus in a voice like gravel under a boot heel, and I heard Marcus scramble, and I heard the door open and close, and I walked to the elevator and pressed the lobby button, and rode down 2 floors with the calm of a man who has been waiting 4 years for a Wednesday morning. The compliance officer called at 11:42. I was on my second coffee at the diner, which wasn't technically open for lunch yet, but whose owner, a wide woman named Rosa who owed Alina a favor from a compliance audit she'd quietly fixed 3 years prior, had let me sit at the counter in exchange for a conversation about the city's zoning board elections. Craig, the compliance officer, said. She had the voice of a woman who had delivered procedural corrections so many times it had become neutral. I think we need to meet. I suggested that this morning. I know, a pause, not here. Not at the office. That pause told me everything. The compliance officer was Arthur's internal watchdog in the same way a surgeon is a hospital surgeon. Employed there, professional loyalties intact, but ultimately governed by a code that superseded the employer. And something in that pause told me she'd spent her morning reviewing documents she hadn't reviewed before. Specifically, I suspected a 1991 trust addendum. You've been doing some reading, I said. Another pause, longer. Where are you? The diner on 4th. I'll be there at 1. She hung up. I looked at Rosa. You got anything to eat back there? It's 11 in the morning. It's been a long week. The compliance officer arrived at 1 on the dot, which is the only way institutional auditors know how to arrive. She was 52 trim, wearing a jacket the color of slate, and carrying a leather portfolio that I was absolutely certain contained a printed copy of Addendum C, 1991. She sat down across from me, ordered water, looked at my coffee, and said nothing about it. You've read it, I said. When did you find it? She asked. 4 years ago. She closed her eyes briefly. 4 years, October, Tuesday, archive room. Banker's box behind the 1998 donor files. She opened the portfolio. There it was, printed, highlighted in yellow with handwritten margin notes in the tight, precise script of a woman who had been auditing nonprofit compliance since before some of my colleagues were born. She turned it to face me even though we both knew I had it memorized. You understand what you're claiming, she said. Operational control, stewardship, voting authority, reversion upon 3 consecutive fiscal years of sub-threshold community distribution. I said valued at current asset allocation, which given the Whitmore property appreciation and endowment growth puts the foundation at somewhere north of I know what it's worth. Craig, then you know what stewardship is worth. She looked at me steadily. He's going to fight this. I know he has resources. He has legal counsel beyond internal. He will make this procedural and long and expensive. I know that too. And you're prepared for that. I leaned forward. I found that clause 4 years ago. I spent 4 years building an immaculate archival record. I documented every distribution memo, every board vote, every approved reclassification request. I have 4 years of clean, unimpeachable service and a director who has actively worked to blur the threshold definition for 3 consecutive fiscal cycles. I sat back. I'm not just prepared. I've been packed and waiting by the door. The compliance officer looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked down at the highlighted clause. Then she did something I did not expect from a woman who had remained stone-faced through a municipal funding dispute that made 3 grant managers quit. She exhaled long and slow, like something she'd been holding for a while. He reclassified gala costs as community outreach, she said. Not a question, more like she was reading it into a record somewhere. Friday the 13th, I said. 3 fiscal years into a tenure that promised transparency, because a donor appreciation dinner bruised his optics. Something moved across her face, something that had nothing to do with procedure. He called my predecessor a liability during the Henderson review in front of the whole compliance team, she said quietly, almost to herself. She looked up. I've audited this foundation for 11 years. I said nothing. I just let that sit. She closed the portfolio, straightened it on the counter with both hands. You're going to need outside counsel. I can't represent you. Obvious conflict, but I know who you should call. She pulled a business card from the inside pocket of her portfolio and slid it across the counter. She's good, better than good, and she will absolutely love this case. I picked up the card, looked at it. One more thing, the compliance officer said, standing, gathering herself back into her professional shape. The board meets Thursday, regular quarterly session. Alina Shaw chairs the governance committee. She held my gaze for exactly 1 second longer than necessary. Attendance is open to any active stakeholder. Then she picked up her water, took 1 sip, set it down, and walked out. I looked at the business card for a long moment. Then I called Alina. It's moving, I said when she picked up. How fast? I looked at the card in my hand, then out the window at the city street. Gray and slow and older than every single problem Arthur Vance had ever created. Faster than he's going to be able to keep up with, I said. On the other end of the line, my 42-year-old wife, who had watched directors dismantle community trusts one gala at a time, who had spent 12 years maintaining professional relationships with people who saw compliance as an obstacle, who had read Addendum C, 1991, and felt something shift permanently inside her. Laughed, really laughed, and somewhere across town in a corner office on the 2nd floor of the Whitmore Administrative Wing, I was willing to bet that Arthur Vance's jaw was tightening again. Good, let it tighten. Thursday was 3 days away, and I had a board meeting to prepare for. 4 years of the archivist, 4 years of bad coffee, manufactured gratitude, and swallowing things that should have been said out loud in rooms full of people. 4 years of watching a 61-year-old man run his foundation like he'd personally invented philanthropy. Thursday came like it always does, quietly without ceremony, completely indifferent to the fact that everything was about to change. I was up at 5:30, showered, dressed, standing in the kitchen in the charcoal suit while the city did its slow, humid morning thing outside the window. Alina came downstairs at 6, saw me standing there and didn't say good morning. Just walked to the cabinet, pulled out 2 mugs and poured. Today, she said, not a question. Today, I said. We drank in silence. It was the most married we had ever felt in 12 years together, which is saying something considerable. I arrived at 8:40 with outside counsel, Victoria Reed, referred by the compliance officer, 53 years old, 36 wins from 39 cases, and the kind of woman who walks into a room like she's already read the ending. We rode the elevator to the 2nd floor. Clara looked up, saw us both, and reached for her phone. Don't bother, I said, we know the way. Arthur was at the head of the conference table, Marcus to his left. Alina Shaw at the far end with a legal pad and reading glasses, and the patience of someone who had been waiting for this particular meeting longer than she'd admitted to anyone. Victoria distributed 12 bound copies of Addendum C, 1991 without ceremony or preamble. The room read, the room went quiet. Arthur's jaw started tightening. This is a stunt, he said. It's a clause, Mr. Vance, Victoria said in the tone of a professor correcting a student who genuinely knows better. A legally binding clause in your own trust addendum. Mr. Thorne has documented 3 consecutive fiscal years of sub-threshold community distribution. The threshold was 35%. The math isn't complicated. I want the compliance officer in here. The door opened. The compliance officer walked in and sat exactly in the middle of the table. Not Arthur's side, not mine, which told the room everything. Tell them it's unenforceable, Arthur said. The compliance officer looked up from her portfolio. The clause is enforceable. I've spent 3 days looking for a way to tell you otherwise, and I cannot find one. She said it the way doctors deliver hard news. Clean, final, I'm sorry. Something moved across Arthur's face that I had never seen there in 4 years. The specific expression of a man who has just run out of room. He turned to me, and he made the mistake that men like him always make when the walls close in. He went personal. You never belonged here, he said. Low, controlled. The voice that had made 3 grant managers excuse themselves from budget meetings for 20 minutes. I gave you this position because my predecessor mentioned your background. You have been a clerk since day one, a meticulous, ungrateful clerk, and you want to stand there and claim stewardship of something you had absolutely nothing to do with building. Dad, every head turned. Alina was at the back of the room. She'd been there the whole meeting, sitting quietly in the corner where everyone had assumed she was one of Victoria's associates. She stood up, smoothed her jacket, and walked to the center of the room with the unhurried deliberateness of a woman who had been waiting 42 years to arrive at this exact moment. Arthur's face did something complicated. "I watched you make my colleagues excuse themselves from budget meetings," she said, quiet, even still, every quarter for 4 years. They'd come back 20 minutes later with their eyes too bright. And you just keep talking like they didn't matter enough to pause a sentence for. She stopped 5 feet from him. "I watched them pack 2 boxes and drive to other foundations because staying had become something they physically couldn't do. And then you spent 4 years punishing them for it." She looked at her boss the way you look at something you finally decided to put down. "You gave Craig this job out of obligation and called him the archivist for 4 years and told a room full of people he was meticulous like he needed your validation to exist." Her voice never rose. That was the devastating part. "You ran this foundation on your predecessor's reputation and your staff's dignity, and today it cost you everything because you reclassified a gala as community outreach and couldn't finish the sentence before the ledger closed." She paused. "I've worked alongside you for 12 years. I have never once been proud of how you treat this institution." She walked back to her seat. Elena Shaw cleared her throat. "All in favor of recognizing Mr. Thorne's stewardship claim under Addendum C, 1991. 7 hands. Arthur sat in silence. It didn't matter. He was already finished. The rest happened the way real consequences always happen. Not in one moment, but in accumulating weight. Clara walked into Victoria's office Friday morning with a 4-year-old manila folder that made Victoria go very still. By the end of that week, 9 former grant managers had come forward. Wrongful reassignment, hostile compliance environment, a procurement complaint that had been waiting 14 months for exactly this kind of momentum. Each case individual, together a demolition. Arthur's legal bills compounded daily. His attorneys stopped softening the arithmetic. The board removed him the following Thursday. He resisted relinquishing operational control for 2 weeks. The resistance of a man who knows that relinquishing means admitting. And then he stopped resisting because pride is expensive and he had finally run the numbers. He transferred stewardship to the board quietly on a Thursday afternoon. No ceremony, no photograph in the lobby, just a signature on a document in a building that had already moved on before he stood up to leave. I accepted stewardship 2 weeks later. Randy asked me why, 3 times in increasing volume. I gave him the same answer each time. I never wanted the title. I wanted the clause. I wanted a man who had spent his life making people feel small to finally sit down at the level of everyone he'd looked down on. That had happened. Everything else was paperwork. The number the board allocated for transitional oversight was more than enough to leave. Elena and I sat at the kitchen table in our apartment one last time. Same table, same mugs. The table where 4 years ago I'd spread that trust addendum and changed everything. "Where?" she said. "Somewhere that doesn't know his name," I said. She looked out the window at the oak trees and the city light and 12 years of quiet endurance. Then she set down her mug. "I'll start packing," she said. We were gone by February. My mother heard the full story from Elena over the phone. When Elena finished, my mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said with the calm of a woman who had earned every single syllable of it, "I always knew that man would run out of people willing to be small for him." Then she asked if Elena wanted to visit for a long weekend. Elena said yes before she'd finished the sentence. Randy called every Sunday wherever we landed. One evening, months after we'd left, he asked if I missed it. I thought about the second floor, the charcoal suit, the banker's box on a Tuesday afternoon that started everything. "Not even a little," I said. "Some men spend their whole lives building institutions." Arthur Vance built one for 15 years and lost it on a Thursday in November because he reclassified a donor dinner as community outreach and couldn't finish the sentence before the ledger closed. 4 years of the archivist, 1 clause, 1 patient man, and a woman who had been keeping score since she was 30 years old and never once lost count. If you liked this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more institution-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of the Sphere.